Welcome. Welcome to tonight's event to hear Dr. Lucy Jones. I want to say to all of you today, congratulations for being here. Because you are the smart ones, making the time to gain a better understanding of earthquakes and the importance of being prepared. The first thing I want to do is thank my field rep, Noreen Sullivan, back there for organizing this whole event. And all the staff members of Pasadena that helped Noreen, please stand up and just wave your hands because you were great. Thank you so much. Before I introduce Dr. Jones, I want to recognize a few people that are here. Megan Rodriguez from Senator Liu's office, right there, stand up please. And a not so new, but fairly new, Chief Washington from our fire department. Right back there. Chief, thank you so much for being here. So here's the format. Dr. Jones is going to present, and there's going to be some time at the end for some questions and answers. Dr. Lucy Jones has been a seismologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and a visiting research associate at the Seismological Laboratory of Caltech since 1983. She currently serves as science advisor for risk reduction in the Natural Hazards Mission of the U.S. Geological Survey, leading long-term science planning for natural hazards research and the SAFRR, that is, the science application for risk reduction to apply USGS science to reduce risk in communities across our nation. In 2014, she led a partnership between the USGS and the City of Los Angeles to create solutions to 4 of the most significant seismic issues in the city. Dr. Jones has authored over 100 papers on research seismology with primary interest in earthquake science, statistics, and integrated disaster scenarios, especially in Southern California, including leading the science projects that created the ShakeOut earthquake scenario, the Great Shakeout drill, and the arc storm scenario. Dr. Jones received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Chinese language and literature, magna cum laude from Brown University in 1976. And she's a PhD in geophysics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1981. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Lucy Jones.
Thank you. Thank you all. I had some discussions and musings about what to present here. And part of this is going to be why we really need to care and what we should care about. We are often afraid of earthquakes for the wrong reasons, and I want to talk a bit about that. Then I want to look at what we can do about it, ways in which we can make our communities safer, and what are the outcomes that we're trying to change. I'm going to look at it both as individuals, but also as a community. As you just heard, I spent a year at Los Angeles City Hall really looking at what the city could do, and the city can do a lot. And I want to see what happened with Los Angeles spread across Southern California. So I hopefully will be creating a few partisans tonight to help take this along, but then also how it relates to what we can do ourselves. So let's start with Southern California and my title here of Imagine America Without Los Angeles. The reality is we could lose Southern California as a place we want to live because of the earthquake. How many of you are afraid of dying in an earthquake? Not too many. That's actually, the reality is more Southern Californians have died from rain than from earthquakes. Flooding and debris flows have killed more Southern Californians. Now, we haven't had our really big earthquake yet. There is going to be one event that will kill many more people, but they aren't that common. You are far more likely to be murdered in Southern California, and even more likely to die on our freeways, right? So it's not really about dying. It's about living through the earthquake and what life will be like afterwards, and whether we are going to be willing to stay here in that event. Let's start by just how a seismologist sees California. Every one of those red lines is one of our mapped faults. We have a lot of them. We have about at least 300 faults long enough to produce a magnitude 6 just here in Southern California, right? But it's what makes California a place we want to live in. The San Francisco Bay is there because of the San Andreas and Hayward Fault opening up the bay. The Sierra Nevada is there because of the Sierra Nevada frontal fault. The San Gabriel Mountains right here are here because of the Sierra Madre Fault that has had a very large earthquake, probably at least 7.5, at twice in the last 15,000 years, okay? So the earthquakes aren't that common, but it's because of those earthquakes that we have these mountains, that we have our beautiful environment, that we have the oil under Southern California that's the reason Los Angeles got developed in the first place, that the mountains are able to trap the clouds and we aren't a complete desert. All of that comes from the faults. So you can't get California without the earthquakes, so we need to figure out how to live with that risk. And as I said, it really isn't about dying. If you look at your chance of dying in a skiing accident, right? If you're an active skier, an estimate of about a 1 in 10,000 chance that that's the way you'll die, at least before we had ski helmets. We have reduced this rate a little bit. Your chance of dying in a lightning strike is actually greater than your chance of dying in an earthquake. It's only on the order of about 1 in 125,000 Americans will ever die in an earthquake. One of my favorite statistics, you actually have a greater lifetime risk of dying from a meteor strike. They are really, really unlikely, but when they happen, they kill everybody. So it actually adds up and your risk ends up being higher. So it's not about dying. It's about living. And it's about living in a city, right? We now live in a megalopolis that depends on very intricate systems to keep on operating. And so what we have defined as our goal is that we are trying to create urban resilience, a city that still functions after you have gone through the earthquake. Well, it's a great goal. How do we even know what needs to be done to accomplish it? First, we need to understand what are likely going to be the problems. And we did this through creating something called the ShakeOut scenario. I don't know, how many of you have heard of the ShakeOut drill? Okay, this is an active group then, yes. So the ShakeOut drill was first created in 2008 to explain the ShakeOut scenario. We had a project that took place over a year. We literally had hundreds of experts working together over a wide range of disciplines. We started with the earth scientist, the geologist, to say what fault it is, the seismologist to say, given that fault, what's the shaking, another type of geologist to look at how we trigger fault offset and landslides. Then we fed it to the engineers, a wide range of engineers looking at all the different problems. That goes into the social science, the disaster managers, the public health, the economics. What are going to be the consequences to all of this? And when we looked at that, we found some things that I expected and some that were quite surprising. We did it for a San Andreas earthquake. And on these figures, yes, we're showing a movie of what the shaking is like in this big event. Notice that we have a red dot down at the bottom. That's the epicenter where the rupture begins. The earthquake does not happen at an epicenter, in spite of 80 years of Caltech telling you that's true. It begins at the epicenter and it ruptures over the whole surface. If the surface is 100 yards long, you have a magnitude 4. If it's a mile long, you have a magnitude 5. To be a magnitude 7.8, you need a fault at least 200 miles long. So we picked a likely part of the San Andreas, and that's the red line there, and we modeled what the shaking would be from this. Notice I have been talking for 53 seconds, and just light shaking has gotten into this area so far, all right? The strongest shaking doesn't arrive until 75 seconds into the earthquake, because the rupture begins at that point and it ruptures up the fault at 2 miles a second. A 200-mile long fault takes 100 seconds to break, right? And then the waves have to travel from the fault to where you are. And they get moving pretty strongly when you get into this area. And I just realized I have the Orange County map instead of the downtown Los Angeles map. The picture's actually looking pretty similar, so we'll get away with it, okay? We have remarkably strong ground motions here, even though we're about 25 miles away from the San Andreas. And the reason is because of our basins, all right? When the waves travel through, they're going through rock, and they go through rock at a certain speed, and they get smaller with distance away from the fault. Let's look at down here, and like down around Palm Springs, you don't have to get very far away from the fault, and the shaking is quite a bit less. But if they move into a place where the rock is much looser, into the soft soil of our alluvial fan instead of the hard rock, the waves slow down when they go into the looser rock. But they still have to carry just as much energy. Therefore, they have to get bigger to carry all of that energy in that longer period of time, right? So the same amount of energy per unit time at a slower speed, the wave has to get bigger. So this is one of the real constants of earthquakes, is when you get into a basin, you're going to have a lot more shaking. And you can see the picture that we modeled out here for the San Andreas. You can see the Orange County area, you can see the San Gabriel Valley, you can see the Los Angeles Basin, you can see the Ventura Basin. All of these are areas of deep sediment. You can get away from this by going up into the hills. If you live up at the top of lake, you're going to have less shaking than if you're down here on Colorado Boulevard. You will also have more wildfires, so you sort of get to pick your hazard, right? And those fires are actually happening a lot more often than the earthquakes are, right? So this is the most extensive model ever done. We've had a variety of ways of checking it because we are seeing these really big motions in the Los Angeles Basin, and we wanted to make sure they were correct. It really does look like it's the case. So then what happens because of this? We then went through all of these other studies. I could spend more time than we have just explaining all of that study. Instead, I'm going to give you a movie that we made about this event, only 5 minutes long, and really show you what we found in this.
Thursday, November 13th, 2008. It's a sunny morning in Southern California. Across the region, 7.5 million people are busy at work. Several 100,000 of them are commuting to jobs in different counties, far from where they live. Over 200,000 commuters work and reside on opposite sides of the San Andreas Fault. Today, these families and many others across the region will be separated. 1,800 people will die. 53,000 people will be injured. And $213 billion in damage will occur. It's 10 a.m. The largest earthquake to hit Southern California in modern times has just begun. Some people react appropriately, others don't. In the intense shaking, nearly 1,500 buildings collapse. Infrastructure is severely compromised, and 300,000 buildings suffer significant damage. The rupture travels 200 miles northwest along the San Andreas Fault, violent shaking lasting as long as 2 minutes in some areas. Finally, the earthquake is over. Many of the lifelines of Southern California have been disrupted. A large number of people are trapped in collapsed buildings. Over 1,600 fires start, some turning into super conflagrations. Millions of people are trying to use their phones, causing the system to become overloaded. In the months ahead, there will be tens of thousands of aftershocks. Residents will struggle to recover from the earthquake. There will be no water for weeks or months, and no electricity. Traveling from point to point within the city will be extremely difficult, and 255,000 people will be displaced from their homes. We are all in this together. We will suffer the consequences if we don't do our part right now. How quickly life gets back to normal after this disaster is up to you and those around you. Your level of personal preparedness will determine your quality of life after the quake. It's a good idea to have a fire extinguisher, a first aid kit, and enough water for each person in your household to have at least 1 gallon of water a day for 3 days. Have an emergency plan. Decide now where you will meet your family after an earthquake. Make sure there's a person out of town you can contact to let your loved ones know that you're okay. Homeowners should be sure to bolt their house to its foundation. Consider whether earthquake insurance makes sense for you as part of your financial plan. Even if you're not a homeowner, you can secure your personal possessions against earthquake damage. Preparedness is not only for the home, but also for business. Be sure that your company has emergency plans for a major earthquake. Empower yourself and your family. Be prepared. For more information, visit www.usgs.gov/shakeout.
Okay, so this is a pretty succinct summary. You want to watch it again, it's at YouTube. Just look for Preparedness Now. If you do that, you can, this was actually created by the Art Center College of Design. I discovered a while down to it that they snuck in a picture of President Obama. You can see if you can see it when you go to watch it again. And share it. It's a great way of sort of summarizing what individuals can do. We also were giving out handbooks when you came in here on, on shaky ground? Oh, right, staying safe when the earth shakes. I've always forgotten the new one. So there's a lot of direct things that you can do as individuals. We have the 7 steps for earthquake safety. But I want to now take a little moment to look at some of the reasons behind these recommendations and also what we can do together. Because what we put in the movie is really for individuals, and there's a lot more that we can do together. I want to start by looking at what a city is and what do we need for this urban disaster resilience. The beginning of a city is pipes. Before we put in our buildings, we put in water pipes, we put in sewer pipes. If we're lucky, we put in electrical conduits underground. And on top of that, we build the things that make our lives. We build the houses that we live in. We build the buildings that we work in. We build our manufacturing centers, our utility systems, our transportation systems, our telecommunications systems. And all of these systems are there to make our lives work. In a modern city, we are in a system of systems, and all of these systems have to work well enough to keep things going, right? They don't have to work perfectly. We have breaks all the time, right? But we have to have enough together that we can live. And as our society becomes increasingly complex, this becomes increasingly difficult. I'm going to go in and look at some of these individually and see what the issues can be in an earthquake. So let's start with buildings. I mean, we may not think of our buildings as a system, but in fact, it's a whole group of buildings together. And when one building is damaged, it affects the others. So what is the earthquake damage that we face? We can be damaged for a variety of reasons. The shaking in an earthquake is our most common source of loss to buildings. We also get very large damage from fires. And in the biggest earthquakes, fires become disproportionately important. I think we all know the stories of 1906 and how San Francisco burned down. Just how good it was before the fire started was a little overemphasized. They tried to make it look like it was only a fire because every city had fires. And San Francisco was sort of special for having the earthquakes, so sort of part of the boosterism was to say the problem was all fire. But even as we're trying, we've actually discovered they doctored photos that were taken between the earthquake and the fires going through. But even when we account for that and trying to work it out, the fires are a very, very large part of it. Same thing in Tokyo in 1923. And part of it is a scale issue. When too many fires get started, no matter how extraordinary the work of our fire department is, we only have so many firemen. We depend upon mutual aid to deal with the biggest events. But we just saw what the scope of this earthquake was going to be. We aren't getting mutual aid from San Bernardino. They're going to be in worse shape than we are. Our mutual aid is going to need to come from the Bay Area and Arizona, and it's going to take a long time to get here, and the fires are going to get out of control beforehand. So one thing that we can do as individuals is after the earthquake, if there is anything you can do to stop a fire growing, it's worth doing. Anytime other than the earthquake, you call the fire department and let the professionals deal with it. After a really big earthquake, if you have any chance of stopping it, you need to do it yourself. Anybody who is ever home alone in your house should know how to use a fire extinguisher, and there better be one in your house for them to use. All right? We also have a huge amount of damage from water pipe damage. Of course, that also contributes to the fire problems. It's one of the big parts of the fire problem. But in addition, just the water itself does a lot of damage. About $2 billion of damage in Northridge was attributed to broken pipes. When we lose these buildings, we kill people, we lose homes, we lose places to work. To recover from it, we need to have manpower, we need to have transportation to get debris removed and new materials brought in. We need to have communications and power to get this done. If it takes too long to get our buildings back, there are long-term consequences. And one of the really big ones is about business disruption. Right? When one building is damaged, that person loses his building, he can't go in it, his tenants can't go in it. But often the adjacent buildings will be red tagged because of the potential that that damaged building will further collapse in the aftershocks. So the loss of a building doesn't affect just the owner, it affects everyone around him. One of the biggest examples of this is the Christchurch earthquake of 2011. I'm going to talk about it a couple of times. They damaged 70% of the buildings in their central business district. 100% were closed because it was just too dangerous to go into that part of town. So the consequences of a damaged building fall on all the people around them. How do we do something about it? One of the most important things is to deal with our older existing structures. Many people think, hey, we have good building codes, we must have good buildings. Building codes are not retroactive. Your building is as good as the building code in place when it was built. We changed the building code substantially after the '94 earthquake, even more so after the '71 San Fernando earthquake. So the '76 code is a very, very different code. Anything built before then has the potential for some really serious problems. How many people own a home older than 1976? Yeah, right? Unless you have had it retrofitted, it has got problems. We just know it. We changed the way in which we build buildings quite substantially. One of the most important things you can do as an individual is get foundation specialist to come in and look at your house. The California Earthquake Authority on their website has a list of certified contractors, people who have gone through their training. You can find someone to do it there. There are a couple of people who have long-term in this in the Pasadena area that are very good at it. Right? So that's for personal homes. It also applies to a lot of other buildings. All right? So unreinforced masonry buildings, also called URMs by the engineers, are your brick buildings. Go walk into Old Town Pasadena, right? Those buildings were all built originally with brick walls holding up the roof. Brick dissolves, the mortar dissolves in earthquakes. If that's the sole support for the roof comes down and it kills a lot of people. Pasadena has mandatory retrofitting of those buildings. If you go into Old Town now, you will see these little metal squares with bolts in the center. Those are metal rods that have been put through the building to hold it up. They should not kill you, probably won't. The walls will come down and they will be a total financial loss after a significant earthquake. There's no way to make a URM stay up in strong shaking. I sometimes say that we should be calling them FPRs for future piles of rubble. But at least they aren't going to kill you. We have two other types of buildings, what are called soft first-story buildings. Think your 1970s apartment building, first-floor parking, little metal rods holding up the second floor. You have a nice rigid second floor and a very soft first floor. The earthquake pushes it. The second floor moves as a unit, and it comes down, a la the Northridge Meadows apartments that killed 16 people in the Northridge earthquake. The city of Los Angeles has about 15,000 such buildings. I don't know the number for Pasadena. There are also concrete buildings. Those are another one of the really serious issues, 50s and 60s, that we know will kill people if we don't do anything. But we actually still have an issue with new buildings. I would say that most people don't know what the building code provides. We actually went and did a survey. I was working with, Dr. Porter from the University of Colorado, surveyed 814 people and asked them, what do you think the building code provides you? Do you think it's saying that a brand new building built to code, is it saying you should be functional? You should be able to walk in and use the building immediately? Do you think it says, it may not be completely functional, but you should at least be able to occupy it? Or do you think it's saying they're trying to make sure you can crawl out alive? Right? So when we asked people this, we found a pretty wide distribution, and actually the largest number was the people who didn't know what it gave us. In fact, the building code is trying to make sure that you crawl out alive. The building code says if you choose to have such a weak building that it's a total financial loss after the earthquake, that's your financial choice to make. Just don't kill people in the process. Right? So when we build a brand new building, we're building it to be a total financial loss, but not kill people. And what does that mean? Okay, so actually, when we say, let's build the building this way, when you dig in detail, it says for the biggest possible earthquake, MCE is engineer speak for maximum credible earthquake. So the largest ground motions that we think will be happening, the probability that the building will collapse should be no more than 10%. Right? Well, what does that mean? A 10% chance of collapsing means 10% of our brand new buildings will collapse subjected to this shaking. Right? Now, not everywhere is going to get the worst possible shaking. It's going to be an uneven distribution. Right? So it won't be quite that high, but it's still very large. And it's not the only thing that can happen. When we look in real earthquakes, we have some buildings that completely collapse, like the Northridge Meadows apartments. There are many, many others that were red tagged, meaning they're so badly damaged, it's not safe to be in them. Nobody's allowed in, absolutely no matter what. And then we have yellow tags. There's some serious problem, maybe we'll let you go in and get your stuff out, but no using the building till you've got it fixed. When we look at California earthquakes, we have seen that for every collapsed building, we have 10 or 13 red tags. And for every red tag, we have 3.8 yellow tags. So that actually 63 impaired buildings for every one that collapses. All right, we compared this against the Napa earthquake, as we had done the analysis before, and got 57 impaired buildings for each collapse. So we're in the right sort of ballpark. What does that mean for the San Andreas earthquake? When we compare the maximum credible earthquake in the code to what the shaking is expected in the ShakeOut earthquake, Dr. Porter did the engineering analysis. His estimate is that just under 1% of brand new buildings will collapse. But that then means that we will have 10% of our brand new buildings red tagged and 38% yellow tagged, and we are only going to have half of our new buildings available to be used. And our older buildings are going to be worse than this. We aren't going to kill people, but how do we keep our economy going? We also discovered when we did this that a lot of people thought we should be doing better. When we asked people what they thought the code should give us, we got a majority wanting at least occupiable. And the other really astonishing part of this is the cost, the extra cost of construction to go from life safety to immediate occupancy is 1 to 2% the cost of the project. We are creating a set of buildings that will be a complete loss after the earthquake for the sake of 1 to 2% the cost of our construction. And we can look at Christchurch to see what the consequences of this are. This is a picture of the downtown in 2010. Not nearly as big as in the Southern California area. About 450,000 people live in the Christchurch area, so sort of Glendale and Pasadena combined. That's the downtown area, quite a vibrant community. Some lucky photographer happened to be up on the hillside during the earthquake. So this is actually during the shaking of the earthquake, or in the immediate minute or two after, as the dust rises up from the damaged buildings. Now, only 2 buildings collapsed. One of them was a quite old structure, one of them was a pretty defective structure, sort of a debate, how did it make it through the inspection process, but if we only have one building we need to debate that about, we'll be doing really well. So basically the building code did what it said it was going to do. Only 2 buildings in partial collapse. But so many buildings were damaged, they ended up tearing down 1,800 buildings over the next year, and this is what their downtown looks like now. They lost their downtown for a magnitude 6.3 earthquake. Right? Now, it was right under the city. Their building code is identical to ours. If anything, they've probably got better enforcement. They've got a pretty law-abiding society. This is what our building code is going to give us. They are rebuilding. They are successfully rebuilding because 95% of their building owners have earthquake insurance. How many people here have earthquake insurance? Whoa, this is better. This is way more than the state average of 10%. Maybe that's because you're willing to come out to this meeting. You've already been thinking about these sort of things, right? 10% of our buildings have earthquake insurance. 95% had it there. How are we going to rebuild when 90% of the people who have significant damage do not have the financial resources coming in to help them fix it? I think we really need to do something about this. The City of Los Angeles is undertaking quite a bit. This is a list of the recommendations that came out of my time in City Hall that the Mayor Garcetti has pushed to go forward. They are mandating the retrofit of soft first-story buildings, the Northridge type, and concrete buildings. This is the Olive View Hospital that collapsed in the '71 earthquake. Right? That's the standard concrete building. You know, I'm really not sure of which ones are in Pasadena. I do know that La Cañada High School is this type of building. It actually has already been inspected, and they discovered it doesn't have the defects. We expect that when we inspect all of the concrete buildings of Los Angeles, that about a third of them will turn out to be okay and not need a retrofit. Because you can't tell from the outside if the problems are there. The problems really get into, like, how are the walls tied together? You know, so you have concrete walls. If they're really, if there's not much connection between them, you can push them apart. They need to be well connected in the corners and the way in which the roofs are connected. So it needs a structural engineer's evaluation. The City of Los Angeles, the City Council passed unanimously these mandatory retrofits. They're going to cost billions of dollars. There's financing programs that are being put into place, but they're requiring it to happen. They've also got a couple of other things that we're trying to do to get people to move towards better buildings. One of them is the idea of a voluntary rating system. How about if you can find out, can you advertise, my building is better and will be usable after the earthquake, can you get more rent? In fact, the building owners, when they talked with us, they really didn't want a rating system. They really didn't want a mandatory one. But they were saying people won't pay extra rent on the short term for something that only happens once every 50 years. And so we'll be at if we build a better building, we're at a financial disadvantage now. Right? Why don't you make everybody build a better building? 1% to 2%, that's just the cost of doing business here. And the quote from the Building Owners and Management Association was, just up the damn code. Right? So I think there's some support for going forward on this, and I guess I've just scared you. I'm doing this also to say we have to, as a community, say this matters. As an individual, you can go fix your own house. It's hard to do anything about our commercial district, but if we came together as a community and said this mattered to us, we could really get movement and get some of these things changed. And I'm taking a lot of time doing this. I want to go through a couple of other things, because buildings are only one part of the problem. The second, or maybe the most dangerous thing we have, is the disruption to our water system. Right? Every earthquake we've ever seen, we see this type of response. This is from the Wenchuan earthquake in China. I could have shown you one from Chile. I could have shown you one from Christchurch. In fact, I got to visit in Christchurch last year and talk with someone whose house wasn't damaged in the earthquake. He's really come through it fine. But he was saying, I never knew how much water it takes to keep my family going. It was taking me 2 hours a day to get the basic water that we needed. They lost the water system for the whole city of Christchurch as well. There's a lot of ways in which we can lose our water. The primary issue really is about earthquake shaking. The pipes are old. 15% of the pipes in the city of Los Angeles are more than 100 years old. You shake them in an earthquake, they crack. You now have a leaking pipe, you can't get the water through. To go and fix it, well, you can find your first break, you stop the water, you find your first break, you fix it, you repressurize the pipe to find the second break, to turn off the water, fix it, find the third break. You have too many breaks, the only way to deal with it is to replace your whole water system. And when we got all of the water companies together and talked about this issue, what would the earthquake really be like? I remember a moment at which one of the guys went, but wait a minute, how much pipe is made in the US each year? That's the scale of problem that we're really going to be dealing with. Now, there are things we can do about it. Right? There are pipes that don't break in earthquakes. The Japanese have developed an approach. There's another approach that's been tested out in New Zealand. The pipes do cost more, and pipes are very expensive things. So it's a very big long-term project. Los Angeles is trying to grapple with finding billions of dollars to replace their water system. But they are looking at it, because if you don't have water, you don't reopen your businesses. You can't open a restaurant, you can't open a beauty salon without water. We estimated the business disruption costs from lack of water in the ShakeOut earthquake to be $50 billion. Right? So if we're really talking about keeping the economy going, we really need to be dealing with that issue. Right? I guess I forgot that I had all this. When you don't have your water, I've talked about the businesses. You also have a really significant impairment to the medical expenses. It's very difficult for people to stay in their homes. So FEMA and Cal OES have major plans for how to bring in water, truck in water for us after the earthquake damages everything, which is great for drinking for a short period of time. It's not really a way to take a shower. And how many of you want to stay when you haven't had a shower in a month? And your neighbor hasn't had a shower in a month, and you've got the public health issues from nobody having had a shower in a month. And that's the point at which we really do worry that if it keeps on going over time and we have trouble fixing it, that we could be facing mass evacuation of people away from the area. This has the potential for the biggest possible damage. There is one other issue besides the pipes, and that's the long-term Southern California issue of where do we get our water from. Pasadena is probably in just about the best position of any city in Southern California because over 40% of our water comes from local sources. With severe rationing, we could survive off of our groundwater. As a very old city, we bought early rights, right? In the city of Los Angeles, 88% of the water comes from outside the region. And outside the region means coming through one of 4 aqueducts, every one of which crosses the San Andreas Fault to get to us. So when the fault moves somewhere between 10 and 30 feet at every point, or 45 feet maybe up to every point along this, all of those water systems are going to be broken. As an example for the city of Los Angeles, this is the Los Angeles aqueduct. In 1908, as they finished construction of the Elizabeth Tunnel coming through the San Andreas Fault. It is a wooden tunnel, 9 feet in diameter. Where it crosses the San Andreas Fault, we expect the fault offset to be about 15 feet. So this tunnel will no longer exist after the earthquake happens. Part of the project with Los Angeles, DWP is charged with evaluating all of the different possible solutions to this and coming up with an approach to make the water come through. And the fact that they're grappling with it is huge. There will be at least the Los Angeles aqueduct after the earthquake, at least if the earthquake waits for 10 years or so and they can get the work done. Right? The California aqueduct, the Colorado River aqueduct, at this point, there are no plans to deal with it. The approach had been, well, right, so we lose an aqueduct. We've got 4 of them. The reality is everyone will break in the same earthquake. That's what it means to be a magnitude 8. So looking again at what the mayor has moved forward on, protecting the fault crossings, reducing our dependence on imported water, and also looking at an alternative water system for the firefighters, which again is another challenging issue, but really worth looking at. The last thing I want to talk about is communications. We have developed a society where we all expect to be able to talk with each other, right? The last time we had a big earthquake, Northridge, was 3 months before the release of the first internet browser. We didn't have a public internet. The only people who had cell phones were really rich and carried around really big things. So what an earthquake does to our communication system is not very well understood. We tried to analyze it and looking at the ways in which it could be disrupted, sort of the same standard causes. We know the consequences could be very disruptive, and emergency services. A lot of emergency services are using cell phones to communicate, right? Hopefully, a lot of them have backup systems. You know, they need to make sure they have really robust backup power for all of those systems. In Japan, they have 48 hours of backup power on all of their systems. They lost electricity for 3 weeks. After the first 2 days, they stopped having communications. Right? And again, the disruption both to sort of on the short term and also on the long term of really big issues. And there's a new issue that we really have created. As I said, there was no internet the last time we had a big earthquake. Our economy has changed in extraordinary ways because of that. For instance, I noticed when I look at the things that depend on the internet, I put supply chain. When Northridge happened, we had our big grocery stores had, warehouses, food warehouses in the Inland Empire. Out in Fontana, Rialto, there were all of these big warehouses stockpiling food, and your local grocery store would, go out to put in an order to the warehouse to bring in the food. They no longer do that. They don't need to. Because of the internet, instant communication, they can order things they need the day they need them, and they don't have to have those warehouses. Our food is cheaper because we are much more efficient not having those warehouses. Except when the earthquake happens, we used to have a stockpile of food on this side of the San Andreas Fault. Right now, all the food we need comes to us across the fault every day. We have 1 to 2 days supply of food on this side of the fault. So it has changed what I recommend in terms of food storage. I used to say, okay, yeah, I've got a freezer, the electricity's gone, I got a lot of food in there, that's what I'm going to be eating. By the time I've gotten through what I have anyway, it's not going to be that far off. Now, recognizing that the stores are going to be bare within a day, that's not really what an option is. And so I've been now recommending to store more food. One thing you could consider doing, buy a set of food, keep it for a year, donate it to a food bank at the end of that year, and buy a new set. You keep your receipt from the first time, you write it off on your taxes. The type of food that you need for this, things like fruit with a lot of liquid in it, some protein sources, maybe some soups, especially low salt soups since water is a problem. Those are all things that the food banks can really use. So I now recommend more food than I used to for precisely this reason. On the other hand, the internet is designed to handle the nuclear holocaust. The internet will still be functioning after the earthquake. The question will be whether you can connect to it. Right? Cell phones will not be working. When we looked at this from the city, one of the big issues is the fact that cell towers are treated like any other structure, meaning they're built to a life safety standard. I don't know about you, but I don't know any people living in cell phone towers. I'm not worried about crawling out alive. I would like them to be working. And one of the things the city of Los Angeles has done is they've designated cell phone towers as a critical facility and require them to be built to a 50% stronger standard. I want to wrap up by looking at what's really at stake here. Right? As I remember, I said at the beginning, we tend to be afraid of dying in an earthquake, and that's not really the issue. When we look at what it does to us economically, you can say in any region you expect to have a certain level of wealth and economic activity that grows with time. If we're not growing with time, we call it a recession. When the earthquake happens, we will lose assets, things will be destroyed, but we also shut down our businesses. Without electricity, without water, things can't function. What we want to do is to get that economic activity back up and operating as quickly as we can. Right? So if you look at what happened in Northridge, yes, a lot of businesses shut down quickly, but then we got the power back pretty quickly. A lot of people had either insurance. We also had a FEMA that was very proactive and was writing checks literally the day of the earthquake. So people went out and hired contractors, they hired subcontractors. We got our economy moving again. In fact, some people argue that Northridge got us out of a recession. It doesn't have to happen that way. If you look at what happens if you can't get that economy going right away, if people don't have the money to rebuild, if there's too much disruption so we can't get basic services going, people start giving up and leaving, you're now losing your employees, you can have a situation where you start to recover, but you just can't quite pull it together, and the economy slumps down. And then even though you do eventually start to get things up again, you will be doing it at a lower level than where you were before, and you end up with a long-term depression. And if you look at the difference in the areas under these curves, the amount of money lost through a delayed recovery can dwarf what happens in the earthquake itself. And one example of this is actually from Nashville and New Orleans. In 2002, New Orleans is a little bit larger economic activity than Nashville. They're a few hundred miles apart, responding to similar regional economic impacts. The Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. There were $80 billion in direct losses in the city and metropolitan area of New Orleans. But if you look at the next 7 years, just by assuming that New Orleans should have been able to keep up with Nashville, you've got $105 billion in losses in those 7 years, and they are continuing to lose at $15 billion a year. New Orleans will never be as big as it was. People can argue that maybe it shouldn't be. It wasn't a very sensible place to build a city under sea level. But this is also the issue that we face if we can't get things up and moving again. And it isn't an issue just for Pasadena. It's clearly a very regional issue. One other last point of comparison, if we look at the populations of San Francisco and Los Angeles through the time of the 1906 earthquake. Before that earthquake happened, San Francisco was by far the largest city of the West Coast. It was the financial center. It was the 6th largest city in the United States. Everything ran through San Francisco. Los Angeles had 100,000 people, was a pretty backwater town. Over the decade after the 1906 earthquake, we had the largest growth in Los Angeles in our history. And by a decade after that earthquake, Los Angeles is larger than San Francisco. We are now 5 times the size of San Francisco. And you can say that San Francisco never recovered what it was of being the financial center of the West Coast. So, what is it that we need to do? I will remind you, there are sets of critical functions that we need to have work to some extent. We base the necessary systems of life on these sort of critical systems. We don't have to have everything working perfectly. If we lose buildings, but we still have the internet, people can telework, and get their work done even if their offices are no longer functioning, and we can keep some things going. If we lose water, but we still have transportation, we can truck in that water to be able to get us through that critical time. So really what we are trying to do is we are trying to be able to function well enough that we can keep the whole system going. And how we get to that functioning well enough is going to be a combination of what we do as individuals and what we do as a community and what we are willing to do after the earthquake to bring our communities back. And you know, I think you can say that Southern California often doesn't do community real well. A lot of us don't know our neighbors. We don't tend to have that sort of interaction. And yet, that's what we're going to need to be able to convince people it's worth staying when life isn't perfect. And we need to get our communities stronger now together, both to handle what happens to us individually and what happens to us together, because we are all in this together, and we're going to rise and fall together as well. Thank you. And once I get started talking, oh, this isn't too bad. All right, we want to have time for questions now, so I'm happy to take questions. It does look like they have set up microphones on the 2 sides of the room, so if you would like to ask a question, we'd like to have you come to the microphone so that everybody can hear the question. Or have I stunned you all into panic? If you could get up and use the microphone if possible.
Well, Pasadena, to some extent, has water supply and also makes its own electricity. So is Pasadena a lot better off than most places? And should we be worrying too much about what's going on with the city of Pasadena, what the city can do, as opposed to making sure that our own homes and businesses are retrofitted to the best extent possible.
Well, I guess I think we need to do both, what we can do as individuals and what we can do as a community. And yes, we have local water, which puts us in better place than many others, but we still have the very old pipes. So the city may have water that can't get to your house. And that is something that we need to look at about how we maintain water service to our homes and to our businesses that can give people jobs here.
There are lots of swimming pools.
Swimming pools are great for firefighting, and they're good for showers.
Right.
Drinking them is not usually advised. It's a desperation measure. And again, it's trying to get people to, that's great for a week or two. Our estimate is that it's going to take 6 months to get water service back to every location, given the present state of our water system. And you don't just handle that off of swimming pools.
How much food should we have? You said you're recommending more.
I'm recommending more. I think it's a somewhat individual choice that depends in part on what you tend to store anyway and how much, do you have in your freezer, whatever. The package I'm putting together for this idea for a food bank, we're looking at something like 3 cans of fruit per person, 3 sources of protein per person, 3 other sorts of meals. That's a really basic level that at least gets you through some of the worst times. We don't really know how long it's going to take the roads to get back in service. One of our problems is that most of our freeways do also cross the San Andreas Fault. The routes into the area that don't cross the San Andreas are Interstate 5 down to San Diego, and then Interstate 8 out along the Mexican border, or Highway 101 to San Francisco. Well, it depends exactly how far north the fault goes. You might get cut off farther north as well. So we need to, one of the other things to do is to look at things that will help us get the transportation system working again. One of them is to deal with the fact that we have gas pipelines crossing the San Andreas Fault right by Interstate 15 at Cajon Pass. So if we could retrofit those to not cause the fire, we're going to be able to fix the freeway more quickly. There's a lot of these cascading connections, but I would look at having extra food for 3 days per person, something like that, and that's a real emergency level. If you feel like doing better donations to the food bank, you could make that larger.
What plans are there in town for emergency medical services to get the doctors to the hospital, to keep the hospital running, and to get into the communities to help, people who need medical attention?
That's a very good question that I have no idea about. I am a seismologist, not an emergency manager. We do have with us the California Office of Emergency Services. I'm not sure if you've gotten this level of detail. Kate Long is with the earthquake program stationed at Caltech with us. Do you have an answer to that, Kate?
I don't have an answer to that, but I think that you need to talk to every locality has to talk to your local emergency.
They can't hear you, Kate. Can you jump? I'll figure this out for you. You're in better shape than I am.
All disaster response starts locally, so your local Pasadena Fire Department and Emergency Management, this is where it starts. California and FEMA and all the counties and local jurisdictions have been doing a lot of catastrophic planning, and there's a catastrophic plan in place for earthquakes, which has to do with a lot of the things that Lucy showed in her slides in terms of how do we get water and how do we make sure there's medical attention, how do we're trying to open the roadways, clear debris, all the things that get all those cascading dependencies back into control. So I can't speak specifically about the plans here in Pasadena, but I can say that there's catastrophic planning, which there are summaries that are available to the public. I get those to you. So that we're working, we will have to go out for mutual aid. We will have to go out of state for aid in a really big disaster. But we have plans for how to get resources in and how to get things repaired as quickly as possible. But in a huge disaster, as quickly as possible, it's not going to feel fast to us. Even if everything goes perfectly, we could be without water in our pipes for months. And certainly we could, even if they're bringing in water, you might not be near a distribution station. It might not get to you first. We don't know. It's a big disaster, so we have to prepare ourselves as much as we can.
I'll do one follow-on comment to that. When we sort of did this big picture analysis of what's going on, emergency response was the best part of it. The issues around mitigation, how to prevent the damage in the first place, and the long-term recovery were both more depressing than what our emergency response looks like.
Are you assuming that the fault will break at the Salton Sea?
In this model, we started it at the Salton Sea. It's a model, right? So when we look at how big earthquakes happen, to be a big earthquake, it's a really long fault. 80% start at one end or the other. 20% start somewhere in the middle and rupture in both directions. So, I mean, we could start in Cajon Pass and go both directions. We could start in Salton Sea. We could start up north, somewhere up towards Paso Robles and rupture to the south. When we made the model, we used the Salton Sea for two reasons. One is, if I had to give odds, I think the southern end is more likely. It's the end, it literally is the end of the fault, so that's a stress concentrator. So that seemed like a plausible, that's sort of more common. The other reason is that by rupturing from the south-north, we cause a lot more damage in Los Angeles. Because, you remember watching the waves travel up, if we had traveled from the north-south, we would have creamed Mexicali. We would have focused the energy to the southern end of the fault instead of focusing it up in here. And doing the model, we weren't doing it to create an international incident, we were doing it to support planning. So we chose the one that affected us more. I think it's got a better chance of happening that way for geologic reasons, but I'll tell you, whenever we've predicted which way it was going to go, we usually end up looking foolish. Yeah.
Yes.
They don't listen to me when I tell them where they should go.
Dr. Jones, would you mind sharing with us how you prepared for this earthquake?
Personally. Okay. Yes, but it'll only be a certain level of usefulness to you. For one thing, my children are grown. They're on their own. And when I gave them emergency kits as Christmas presents, they were like, "Oh, Mom." So I made sure they had emergency kits. I made sure that they had a certain level of supplies. When they were younger, I made sure they knew anybody who was alone in the house had to go through figuring out how to use the fire extinguisher and how to turn off the gas. That was our requirement. And we do have communication plans. We all had an agreement about an out-of-state relative that we would, well, actually she's in Stockton now. I guess we kept it with her even though she moved back into state. So my sister, out of state, we all agreed we would try to connect with her so that if we couldn't connect with each other, we would have a relay point. We've taken all of our personal papers that matter to us, insurance, marriage certificate, birth certificates, scanned them and put them on a thumb drive that I keep in my purse. So I'll always have that information with me. I used to depend on my swimming pool for water, and we moved, and I don't have a swimming pool anymore. And I think my water is my weakest part of it. I do have a 75-gallon water heater, which is a good source of water. We have a certain amount of bottled water, and I'm planning to be at work, and I have a big water supply at work. And I can walk to work. I live a mile from the office. So I said I'm okay, but not great. And then I've started doing this supply of food that I'm planning to donate once a year. I've just personally gotten started on that. The other thing, and I consider this really important, we have moved a few times. Every time we've bought a house, we have brought in a foundation specialist to inspect our foundation and give us advice on what we could do to make it stronger. And I've never spent more than $2,000 in that process. So, of course, there are houses we wouldn't buy. And I actually, the one we recently moved and we're planning to take out the chimney. It's a big old brick chimney, and I've seen too many pictures of big old brick chimneys coming through the roof and causing a hell of a lot more damage than just replacing the chimney. So even though it's a lovely feature of the house, we've decided we're getting rid of it. Hasn't happened yet. What else am I doing? All of our bookshelves in our house have been hooked to the wall. One of the computers is hooked down, the new TV isn't hooked down yet. We got liners for all of our dishes that are that friction material. So if you push it sideways, they don't move. You pick it up, it's not stuck. It's lovely stuff. You can buy it at Target. You know what it's called? I don't know. It's like this friction layer thing, and so you just put the dishes on it, and they won't be sliding out of the cupboard. We have not latched the cupboards, and we've talked about it, haven't done it yet. So maybe part of this is the reality that even when you're almost being professional gives you too much information. Sometimes not getting but yes, I thank you, Kate. That's a good way. It's a process, and we've gotten we do pieces of it. We do something each year and move towards it. There are certain things I would never tolerate, which is having a bookshelf that could fall on a bed, or on one of my musical instruments. Things I really value. I do have musical instruments, and I store them in hard cases at all times. I never leave them sitting out because I'm not willing to go through the expense of replacing them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you were up next, and then you. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for giving us this very well-needed information. I have two questions. We've been having a lot of smaller quakes. There was one recently in Devore a couple of weeks ago. Is this I know you've talked about them not being precursors. My concern is that they're happening more often, and I want if you could speak on that. And the other question I have is, we're in a brick building here. If we were in this situation right now and a 7.8, right, what would you recommend for everybody to do, not do? Thank you.
Let me start with what to do if the earthquake happens. Drop to the ground as soon as you can before the earthquake puts you there. Oh, thank you, Kate. Cover your head to protect yourself from things that are flying around. Notice, now if this was a real earthquake, she'd probably scoot over and get under the table, because a table, even a weak table, really does do you a lot of good. But the most important thing is to get down to the ground before the earthquake puts you there. We have seen tens of thousands of sprained ankles and broken legs from people trying to run in earthquakes. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do. A lot of people want to run outside. The immediate outside of a building is the most dangerous place. That's where you have facades falling down, where you have glass being broken. To get from here to a nice, safe outside location, you have to run, which is very dangerous, and you have to go through the most dangerous place there is. It's not a good idea. If we were to have it at this moment, we have a table, none of you do, I'd still say get down and try and protect your head. If you are agile, great, go down on the ground and get under the chairs. For those of us for whom getting back up from that is probably a little less than we want to deal with, this is a great way to do it as well. Just getting yourself small so that the flying objects have less to connect with you, and protecting your vulnerable insides and your vulnerable neck.
You said small things. What about large things like that air conditioning?
Even so, it's not like it's great, but it's better than any alternative. How many of you have heard of the Triangle of Life? Fraud. Literally fraud. I don't know why the guy's doing it, what he thinks he's going to get out of it, but it is based on a completely made-up story of dead school children in Mexico City. That earthquake happened at 7 o'clock in the morning. There were no dead school children. We even went so far as to contact the mayor of Mexico City and confirm it. There were no dead school children. We don't know why he made it up. It's based on complete lie. And there's no reason to think that if the building were to collapse, which it probably won't, Even though these are brick walls, this is I just don't think bricks really holding up the wall, holding up the roof. I think there's steel in the wall.
That's just the facade. There's concrete behind. You can see it from here.
Okay, yes, that, I thought so. It's still what? Right, and it's not unreinforced, right, it's reinforced. So it's, the chances of things coming down are extremely small. Even if they did, the best thing you could do is be in a small space and protect your head and be able to maintain a breathing space, and you get dug out. It isn't what it feels emotionally, but it is the best thing to do.
The farther you move, the more likely you are to be injured. Some studies done after Northridge, and that if you try to run while the earth is shaking, we had a lot of dislocated shoulders and broken cheekbones and things like that. The number one injury after Northridge was glass in people's feet because it was early in the morning and they ran out barefoot.
Okay. On the number of earthquakes, they actually aren't, there's no statistically significant change in the rate. There is something, the earthquakes happen randomly, and so if it never clustered, it wouldn't be random. If there were even distributions, then it's not random. So by definition, random means sometimes they cluster, it just means there's no meaning to the cluster. And as far as we can tell, random is the best description of how the earthquakes happen. The other thing that's happened is we've been through a relatively quiet period. So we've sort of reestablished a spurious baseline. We think that the really quiet time of the last decade is normal. On the long term, it's not. The long-term average is about 100 magnitude 3s a year in Southern California, so about 2 a week. And what is different is because of the internet, you are hearing about them. As someone who has watched the rate go by for 30 years, I don't think we're having a lot of earthquakes. And actually, we've done statistical tests, and we're not. That said, and that's so there's just, there is one non-random piece of earthquake behavior. When one earthquake happens, another one becomes more likely. Mostly they're smaller, and we call them aftershocks. 5% of the time, the aftershock gets bigger than the main shock, and then we change the name and call the first one a foreshock. And that ability to trigger another earthquake dies off with distance, dies off with time, and dies off with magnitude. So a really big earthquake triggers more earthquakes than a small earthquake. And those equations are actually very well understood. And we are setting up a system, it should be done soon. It was supposed to be going online last August, but we'll get there. It's the government. That will start what we call operational aftershock forecasting. An earthquake happens, there will be an automatic post on the web, what's the chances that it'll set off something else, and we'll be updating those with time. So actually there is something called the California Integrated Seismic Network. Well, actually, Southern California Seismic Network, there's a lot of websites. Southern California Seismic Network, scsn.org. There is a notice posted up there about the probability of different types of aftershocks after every main shock of at least magnitude 5. But 5% of them will be bigger than the first one. So but that within the next 3 days. It's 5% chance within 3 days. That type of triggering thing happens very quickly. It dies off very quickly. The biggest aftershocks, though, raise the level of earthquakes so high that it jumps up, dies off quickly, and then there's a tail. If you only jump up a little, you're pretty quickly back to the background. If you have a really big earthquake and you jump way up, that tail can go on for a really long time. So the last magnitude 5 aftershock to Northridge happened in 1997. The last magnitude 5 aftershock to the 92 Landers earthquake happened in 98. The last magnitude 5 aftershock to the Kern County earthquake of 1952 happened in the 80s. Okay, so that was a magnitude 7.5 in a very quiet area. So aftershocks are the one non-random piece. Outside of that, we don't see a pattern. But there's one other issue. We see patterns because they would make us less scared. one thing, humans are really good at finding patterns in random distribution. We have constellations. And a very large part of the fear of earthquakes is from the unpredictability of the earthquake. And if we could make a pattern, if earthquakes happen when it's hot, then it's okay when it's not hot, right? So that we make those patterns because it makes us feel better about it. But by the way, earthquakes don't happen. There is no correlation with Santa Ana's or earthquake weather. There is a tradition of earthquake weather in every culture that has earthquakes. And what that weather is the weather they had at their most significant earthquake. So we hadn't had an earthquake for quite a while, and we had the Whittier Narrows earthquake in a big Santa Ana condition. But you know, how often is it really hot on October 1st? You know, that's sort of what we usually do. And so our generation tends to talk about earthquake weather as hot weather. My mother's generation that went through Long Beach, it happened March 10th in Long Beach, and it was really still and sort of dank and really wet. My mother, when it got that really fog that sort of sat in on you, or low marine layer, not really foggy, but low marine level, no wind, dank, she'd call that earthquake weather. And so it really is about a cultural issue around that thing, and we're less frightened. Same thing with earthquakes in the early morning. That one, and we really wish that one was true, because if earthquakes only happen in the early morning, you'd know where your kids are. Sorry, I keep on talking.
That's all right. Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah.
I live just below Sierra Madre Boulevard. That means it's very close to the Sierra Madre Fault. What's the option of the San Andreas breaking up all the way from there, and then it comes westward to us? We're a mile or two away. I would take it that most of these people live within a mile of the Sierra Madre Fault. Okay. And then there are all the many faults all under LA that also could be triggered as well.
You've got it exactly right. We talk about the San Andreas because it's the fastest moving fault and therefore the most likely source of a really big earthquake. It is far from the only fault. We have hundreds of them. Actually, we have enough that the next earthquake's probably not the San Andreas. The Sierra Madre produces earthquakes, really big earthquakes, like 7.5, once every 5 to 10,000 years. There is really interest, as a scientist, we think it's really cool trying to figure out how faults could connect. And one of the earthquake models, actually rupturing from the San Andreas onto the Sierra Madre is very difficult to do when you look at the stress changes that are caused by the rupture propagation. However, rupturing up the San Jacinto Fault and coming on the Sierra Madre turns out to be a really likely one. And we get very excited, then we think, wait a minute, I just talked about an 8.5 for my own city, I don't want to be doing this. And I think that is the thing, that they happen very rarely, but we probably do very rarely have 8.5 that happen on multiple faults and cause strong shaking for 20 million people. It just probably won't happen. Yeah.
Yes, on a lighter note, you mentioned your children had all grown up. I can still remember you appearing on television with about a 1-year-old in your arms.
Yeah, thank you. He got married last year. If we all want to feel a bit older.
Thank you for your very pessimistic approach to the Sierra Madre Fault.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Doctor. I believe there's 25,000 hospital beds in LA County. So the best thing we can do is to be our own first responders. I'd recommend the search program, and maybe the fire chief will speak about that. And you can also have Sierra Madre. In the last windstorm we had, we lost electricity for 4 days. So the power shuts off in grids, so you might not have a problem in your immediate area, but you will have loss of power, maybe loss of water too. So I would think that the 3-day is very short on what we should do. To prepare, I would think a month, 3 months if you can. Water is the most imperative things. You can buy 55-gallon drums for about $80. They put something in it. It keeps for 5 years. You just needed to put it on a piece of plywood if it's over on cement. But I recommend at least one member of your family go to a search training. Thank you.
All really wonderful points. One thing on the water that I heard, a really cool idea, getting the 55-gallon drum plumbed into your water line. Because I'm trying to convince my husband this is worth doing. Put it next to the water heater, plumb the water line through it, continually refreshed. You don't need to put the treatment in. You automatically have 55 gallons of water. I know some schools that have put in cisterns going into the school, and then they have a large supply of water for the kids that are going to be there. And I'm going to ask Kate to finish this up with a question, with a response on CERT.
Most rescues, something like high 90% of rescues are done by people around you. Our first responders, there's just not enough of them during a big event like an earthquake. So CERT is an incredible advantage you can have. The Community Emergency Response Team, it's not just learning about first aid and all kinds of things that can help you and your family, but it's about doing it with your neighbors or with your group at work. There's a workplace CERT as well. And talking about how you will organize, and how you're taught to organize in CERT is the same way emergency management organizes, which is functionally what needs to be done and how can we help each other do it, because we're all in this together is really important. And in a disaster, even a few people who know what to do can take control in a group situation and help everybody. So Pasadena has a great CERT program, so talk to your council member's office, and it's a great idea.
Yeah, Lisa Dadarian is the emergency coordinator for the city of Pasadena and helps arrange a variety of CERT programs. There's a great opportunity for it here. So I want to thank you all for having taken the effort of coming out here, and to Mr. Masuda for having us come.
She's got a lot of food.
How about a big hand for Dr. Lucy Jones and her friend that happened to be here, Kate Long. Thank you so much.